Hello everybody, how are you all doing? Welcome to the Northside Ghost Walk. My name is John, I'll be your tour guide. How are you doing? So before we get started, can I get a show of hands please for everybody here who genuinely believes in the paranormal, please? Alright, cool. A lot less cynics than usual, fair enough. Cool, well we'll start by talking a little bit about where we are. As you guys know, we're here on the north side of Dublin. Dublin is divided in two by the River Liffey into north side and south side, which is the other side of the river. In general, the north side would be considered a little bit rougher than the south side. It would be a little bit less affluent. Historically, that's always kind of been the way. Because when Dublin was founded by the Vikings, they settled on the south side of the river. But the Anglo-Normans promptly invaded and kicked them over here to the north side, where the land was a little bit less arable and everything was like a little bit less pleasant for them. In return for this harder lifestyle, they left behind a very bloody history. Hopefully we'll be talking a little bit about tonight. But we'll begin our Northside Ghost Walk. The building over here to my right. This is the Jervis Street Shopping Centre. It is the most haunted, shopping centre in Europe. Take that, Prague. I hope. But yes, it is the most haunted shopping centre in Europe. When it was built originally, it was built as a stately home of an individual by the name of Lord Charlemont, who, when he moved out in 1796, it was repurposed by a group of enterprising young surgeons into Jervis Street Hospital, which now we're starting to see how it might be a little bit haunted, yes? It was in fact one of the busiest hospitals in Ireland. Of course, it would be being in the city centre of Dublin, where we usually see about 7,000 patients annually. But now, of course, it is a shopping centre, and a lot of these sort of echoes and fainted ghosts of the past still cling on in there. For example, inside Champion Sports in the shopping centre, there's often people, the people who work there, whenever they're taking a lift down to their stock room, they often apparently hear a voice whispering very gutturally and harshly to them to leave. Now, whether or not that's a ghost or whether or not that's the conscience of a 30-year-old college graduate still working in Champion Sports, that is entirely your decision to make. But of course, not only that, but from this spot, Day FM, which is a national radio broadcaster here in Ireland, used to broadcast. And on their last day of broadcast there in 1996, they had Ray Darcy, who's a national treasure, am I right, lads? Yes, national treasure, undisputed. Conduct a series of interviews with the people who would work there and see if they'd encountered anything unusual or paranormal while working there. First of all, a group of the lads who worked in the office said that there was a chair that would often sit in the middle of the floor whenever they came in the morning or whenever they came in after their lunch. And the chair would be in the middle of the floor and it would just spin and spin and spin on its own. And it would spin and spin and spin unless somebody put their hands on it and physically stopped it. Otherwise it would just keep going apparently. And not only that, but a woman who worked there, she was a sound editor, she was putting together a program for the next day's broadcast when she heard soft and gentle singing coming from one of the booths, one of the recording booths. And so she went to investigate, assuming that somebody had left one of the radios switched on. And when she got in there, she heard this soft and gentle lullaby coming from the electronics. She didn't recognize it at all. And as she went over to switch off the power, she found that it was actually already off. And that room that she was working in to turn off that radio, that was part of the nursery previously when it was a hospital. So it's not too difficult to imagine the echoes of a young nurse trying to rock a kid to sleep at silly o'clock in the morning, you know. So the next building I'd like to point out is just over here. This is the church bar where we met. A very fancy establishment. But prior to it being a fancy eatery and all-night bar, you were inside. What did you think?
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful. You know? And that's a North American saying that. I don't know if you're Canadian or not, so apologies. But prior to it being a venue, a bar and restaurant, it was, of course, a church. It was St. Mary's Church, a Church of Ireland church here on the north side of Dublin. It stood for a very, very long time. And in fact, a lot of important things happened in that church. For example, Arthur Guinness was married there in 1761. Not only that, but Theobald Wolfe Tone was baptised in this church. Now, Theobald Wolfe Tone, for our non-Irish guests, would be a very, very important figure in Irish history. He kind of like be our version of George Washington, in that he was a product of the Enlightenment. He believed in crazy ideas like equality and stuff, and he led a rebellion against the British. The only big difference between Tone and George Washington was that Wolfe Tone lost. But we still have a soft spot for him. In fact, this street here is named after him, Wolfe Tone Street. This square where we're standing right now is known as Wolfe Tone Square. And yes, he led the 1798 rebellion and is generally regarded well by Irish history. Somebody who's not regarded well by Irish history is an individual by the name of Colonel Henry Luttrell. Colonel Henry Luttrell was shot and killed while attending this very church. He was walking in, a man in his 80s, when somebody jumped up from the churchyard and shot him in the face, and he died instantly. Now I'm sure you're probably thinking an old man unfortunately dying, being murdered, that's a shock. But like I said, he's regarded quite poorly by Irish history. He's a traitor, in fact. He fought during the Battle of the Boyne with the forces of the Catholic convert King of England James II against the Dutch Protestant forces of William of Orange. Luttrell, seeing which way the battle was turning, promptly turned against the Catholic forces and smashed them in association with, of course, Protestant forces from the Netherlands. He was rewarded for this by being allowed to keep his title and by being allowed to keep his lands, and by being rewarded with his brother's lands, because his brother, who also turned against the Catholic forces, didn't do it in time. So yes, and as I said, we regard Wolfe Tone so well that when Wolfe Tone lost, somebody dug up Colonel Henry Luttrell and smashed his skull in with a rock. Even though getting shot probably sorted him out in the first place, used to say really. But now, so this was a church in operation until 1985. And do you guys think this church had a graveyard? Wouldn't be much of a ghost walk if it didn't. But this is it. This is in fact the graveyard of St. Mary's Church. In 1985, when it was deconsecrated, and this land was sold to the Dublin Council so they can make it into a nice park, which they will eventually finish, I assume. Do you guys think they disinterred all the dead bodies who are still buried here? No? No, they did not. There's still a rig of dead people right beneath us. You know, in fact, we're going to go right on down there to some of those headstones and talk about some of the people who are still buried here. Down here. So yeah, as a show of respect, when the Dublin City Council turned this area into an awful park, they moved all the gravestones down here, where we continue to respect them by leaving our empty cans and general rubbish still here. You know, in fact, the one time I was doing this tour, it was just me and this one girl from Canada. We were down here, I was doing my tour, and a guy rocked on up there and proceeded to relieve himself against the gravestones just up there. You know, no shame. That's Dublin. But yes, there's two people still buried here of tremendous historical note. They would be Mary Mercer. First of all, she was a very wealthy lady and a philanthropist. She was responsible for the construction of Mercer's hospitals here in Dublin, which stood for a very long time before their operations were taken over by the Beaumont Hospital. In order to help fund these hospitals, Mary Mercer kind of also inadvertently invented the charity concerts. So really it's all her fault for Live 8. You know. George Friedrich Handel was in Dublin composing the final part of the Messiah, the Hallelujah Chorus. We all know how that one goes, yeah? Well, it's a few bars.
I'm not one.
Ah well. You're the one in my direct line of vision.
For you should start it off.
Ah no. Nobody wants to hear that. We'll just stand here. I got nothing but time. You know?
What's the matter?
Yeah, you know, but no. Yes, the Hallelujah Chorus, we all know it. It was here in Dublin that he actually composed it, and the first ever performance of it was done over on the south side. where there's actually the music hall is no longer standing, but part of its wall still is. It was a huge success. In fact, the style at the time was for women to wear these massive hoop dresses. They were all told not to wear them, to take the hoops out of their dresses, so that they could fit more people into the venue. They ended up making, yeah, sorry? Alright. I said really, and I'm like, yes. But they in fact ended up raising about £400 for Mercer's hospitals, which is a lot of money for the time. I mean, adjusted for inflation, I'd say it's about 4 million bajillion pounds. But then again, I'm not an economist, so sorry about that. Next up, we have another figure who's very much the opposite of Mary Mercer. His name is Lord Norbury. Lord Norbury was a judge here in Dublin. He was known far and wide as the hanging judge. He was not very well regarded. In fact, he was known for hanging innocent men as well as guilty men. What are we looking at?
Looking at the pinch.
Don't worry about it. Just stay far away. Actually, you go stand over there. You kids can't be trusted together. No, Lord Norbury, he was known as the hanging judge here in Dublin. He hanged anybody who came before him, innocent, guilty, otherwise, everybody. And the general modus operandi of judgment was to bring people before him, have them first of all protest their innocence very passionately, beg for mercy, in fact, and until they basically would talk themselves out, Norbury would just sit up there and listen to them very disinterestedly, before finally, when they could speak no more, he turned to his bailiffs and just sort of gesture and say, hang them. And off they went to the gallows. In fact, one innocent man that he hanged was convicted for stealing a sheep, which was actually a capital crime for the time. So he was hanged, and about 2 days later, the man's brother, his parish priest, several of his friends from home, and in fact the man who did steal the sheep came in with the sheep that he stole, made a bit of a fuss, complained about how Norbury had hanged an innocent man, and demanded some sort of justice. And when they were finished, screaming and roaring and ranting and raving, Norbury turned to his bailiffs and said, hang them all for wasting our time. And they did. All of them were hanged. And the first man who was hanged, his wife, was distraught by what happened. She took to her bed and she allegedly placed a curse on Norbury, that he would never ever have a good night's sleep again. And apparently, Norbury did in fact suffer from insomnia for the rest of his days. And proving once and for all that the good die young and pricks live forever, Norbury died peacefully in his 80s at home. But on the day that he died, on the night that he died, his staff apparently saw a large black creature roaming the lands of his stately home. No one's quite sure what it was. It might have been a big dog, it might have been a small bear, or it might have been the spirit of Norbury, or even in death he couldn't get a good night's sleep. I mean, I know which one I prefer, you know. So we're actually going to carry on to our next stop. It's just down this way. Let's carry on. Anyways, guys, now we're about to walk up into a spot here that where something really bad happened long time ago, and it actually still holds over. The psychic energy kind of still holds over, apparently, or so I've been told by people who know more about this than I do. I've actually seen it happen, where when we enter this area here, that somebody was overwhelmed basically by a sense of disquiet, by a sense of fear, loathing, of general darkness. And now, okay, she was very young, and oh, here's a ghost. She was very young, she was only about 13, but she did literally run out screaming out of the alley. So if there's anybody here of a particularly sensitive disposition to the paranormal, and you don't want to get freaked out, no one will think any less of you for staying down here, alright? Don't worry about it. No one will think any less. It's fine. Fine then. Well, you're all very brave. Congratulations. So, yes, here to my left is a lovely warehouse. But prior to it being a lovely warehouse, it was the site of St. Mary's Abbey. St. Mary's Abbey was a Cistercian abbey, famous for multiple reasons over the years. For example, St. Thomas standing here in 15 odd. Can't remember the exact numbers. 34, super. Unfortunately, St. Mary's Abbey didn't stay standing forever, as we can see. What ended up happening was, towards the end of St. Mary's Abbey's existence, there was a king in England by the name of Henry. Didn't like his wife anymore. You may have heard about him. So rather than, I don't know, do something mad with Catherine of Aragon, Henry decided he'd just get divorced. But that was a problem for Henry because he was a Catholic. At the time, Catholics could not get divorced. So he wrote a letter to the Pope requesting a special dispensation for a divorce pardon. But at the same time this is happening, so too was the Reformation in mainland Europe. And one of the biggest issues during the Reformation was the selling of indulgences. For those of you who don't know, that's literally when wealthy people would buy themselves spots in heaven or other sort of benefits from the church. And if the Pope would have given in to Henry, which he would have done 9 times out of 10, that a powerful king like Henry requested something like that, the Pope would get A-OK. But this time he couldn't really handle the PR nightmare that it would have been. So instead, Henry just said, screw you, I'm starting my own church, which is how we got the Church of England. Now, it's worth pointing out at this point that some people believe that maybe Henry didn't really want to divorce Catherine of Aragon because he didn't like her anymore. I mean, after all, he was the king. He could have just locked her up in a tower and said she was sick or dead or whatever. So why did he go through all the hassle of trying to get a divorce from the Pope? There's some people who will tell you that it was because the crown was broke. Henry needed money and income to basically further his plans for the British Empire. And of course, the church lands in England and Scotland and Wales, they didn't pay any taxes. It was just land that he couldn't claim any income on. So by creating a new church with himself as the head of it, everything that church made would have to go through Henry. Of course, to give that an air of legitimacy, Henry made a deal with the clergymen in the UK and all the abbeys throughout England, Scotland and Wales. He made the same deal with them. He said to them, I need people like you, people who can read and write. So if you come on out, I'll give you a nice cushy deal, I'll give you a new position in my church, I'll give you lots of nice clerical work so that you guys wouldn't starve. Or you guys can stay in there and we'll lay siege to you and eventually we'll get in and we'll kill you. So naturally enough, they all kind of came out and took their new positions with Henry's new church, and the lands were put to good use by Henry in theory, but for some reason he didn't give the same offer to Irish abbeys. To places like St. Mary's Abbey, the deal that Henry offered to them was you can stay in there and eventually we'll lay siege and we'll get in and we'll kill you, or you can come on out and we'll kill you. So again, giving into human nature, they locked the doors and barricaded themselves in, and the siege lasted for months and months and months until eventually the siege was broken and the forces of King Henry got in and slaughtered every single monk that was in there. Killed some of them where they were standing, some of them where they were kneeling, praying for salvation to God who was too busy, I guess. And that's what happened with St. Mary's Abbey. They promptly ripped it all down and used the material, the rocks and stones, to build bridges across the River Liffey. Within a couple of generations, the people of Dublin actually forgot this was where St. Mary's Abbey was found. It wasn't until a young archaeologist, whose name has actually been lost to history in the early 1800s, went and broke in here and dug up the floorboards and eventually fell into a secret room, that we discovered that this is where St. Mary's Abbey used to be. Anyways, I see nobody freaked out, nobody had any panic attacks, everybody alright? Super. Let's carry on to the next slide. Seconds, gang. So yes, this is going to be one of the shorter stops. Right over there is the forecourts of Dublin. It's the largest courts in Ireland. A lot of stuff happens there, and it's basically more or less the legal centre of Ireland, this whole area here. It used to be known as Oxman's Town. Oxman's Town is actually a phonetic corruption, which is how this town got its name from Ostman's Tune. I'm sure I've butchered the pronunciation of that, but I don't think we've got any Scandinavians in the tour this time, do we? Excellent. But yes, so Ostman's Tune literally meant the town of the men from the east, because after Dublin was formed on the south side by the Vikings, they got kicked over here by the Anglo-Normans and reinvented themselves over here and reinvented this whole area here into Ostman's Tune, where it got phonetically corrupted into Oxman's Town, and that is why this area is known as Oxman's Town. Although not really anymore. These days, like I said, it's mainly just known as the legal district. So we carry on. Our current spot, St. Mickens Church. Now, St. Mickens is actually my favourite stop in this tour. St. Mickens is really cool for a bunch of reasons. First of all, upstairs in St. Mickens in the actual church itself is the organ where our old pal Handel allegedly composed the Hallelujah chorus. How does that go again? You don't I know, yeah, it's like this. You can stay here, the rest of us are going to go on the floor, you stay here. And think about what you've done. So yeah, see, this is where he supposedly composed the final part of the Hallelujah chorus. One day he was sitting at the organ, apparently was very severely writer's blocked, and he got up for a walk to try and clear his head. And he got up and he walked all the way up to Fishamble Street. Now, Fishamble Street is where the alleged Molly Malone existed, the seller of fish and, of course, the occasional prostitute. And Molly Malone, according to legend, again, guys, according to legend, Molly and Handel met up, so money was exchanged, and she went back to his gaff, where, according to legend, she promptly screamed, "Hallelujah!" and inspiration struck. But the cool thing about St. Mickens isn't actually upstairs, as cool as that organ is. No, the really cool thing in St. Mickens is downstairs, in the crypts. These crypts, they're made out of limestone. It's very, very interesting. But buried down there are the Shears brothers. Now, the Shears brothers were loyal lieutenants of Wolfe Tone during a 1798 United Irishmen's Rebellion. They were barristers from County Cork. And of course, once the rebellion failed, one of the reasons why the 1798 rebellion failed actually was because the United Irishman group was infiltrated almost immediately by British spies. They knew all of the plans, they knew everything that was going to happen. That's one of the reasons why it was brought low so quickly. But after the rebellion, the British Army promptly captured 1,200 United Irishmen, including the Shears brothers, who were convicted of high treason because of their involvement in the leadership. That meant that they were sentenced to the cruelest punishment the British government had. They were hung by their necks until they were almost dead, and then before they passed out, they were cut down. They were then tied to a chair, and before them was a red-hot brazier. Brazier is kind of like this long strip of metal with coal underneath it, making it just hotter and hotter and hotter. Kind of like a hot plate or something. And from there, they had their stomachs sliced open, their guts pulled out, and before their very eyes, placed on the red-hot brazier in front of them, and they got to see and hear and smell their own guts cooking in front of them. And then just as that agony couldn't get any more severe, they had their heads chopped off, and their bodies were divided in four and spread out all over Dublin, a process known as being hung, drawn, and quartered. Now obviously we got their bodies back and we put them back in St. Mickens, and in between them, in St. Mickens crypts, is the burial mask of Theobald Wolfe Tone. Wolfe Tone was captured just like everybody else after the rebellion, and he was sentenced to be hanged. Wolfe Tone took that as a tremendous offence. He felt that hanging was a punishment for a common criminal, and he requested that he be killed by firing squad, a soldier's death, to know how he termed it. This was denied, and on the day before his execution, apparently he somehow had a knife smuggled into his cell, where he cheated the hangman by slitting his own throat. But he missed the artery, so instead of bleeding out in seconds, he lay there gurgling and spluttering and drowning in his own blood for 8 agonizing days before he finally died. But even that's not the coolest thing about St. Mickens. No, as I mentioned, St. Mickens is made out of limestone. Limestone is very good for maintaining moisture in the air. That moisture in the air is very good for preserving dead bodies. It's not very good for preserving wood though. At the time St. Mickens was an active crypt, the style was for them to stack the coffins one atop the other, and they had 4 coffins there where the wood was warped by the moisture in the air, and they promptly fell over, smashed open, revealing 4 honest-to-God mummies downstairs in St. Michael's Church, in the crypts. They became known as the Crusader, the thief, the nun, and the unknown woman. Now, as far as the unknown woman goes, I'm afraid not much was known about her. Next up we had the nun. The nun was buried in full nun's regalia, that's how we know she's a nun. The thief is so named because he's actually missing a hand, which is quite irregular because that wasn't really a common punishment for thieves at the time that he was living there. It was much more common for them just to be hanged. So carbon dating has kind of basically proven that we've been bad-mouthing this guy for centuries, I'm afraid. You know, and finally there is the Crusader. The Crusader is so named because, well, first of all, he was a giant of a man, well over 6 feet tall, which for the time that he was living made him huge. But he's named the Crusader because his legs are crossed in thus fashion. Now, during the Crusades, when the Christians and the Muslims would cease battle for the night time, they wouldn't be able to bring in all their dead in time, basically, before the sun rose again. And so what they did was, in order to differentiate between Christian and Muslim, they would cross the Christian men's legs like so, so that they would know that they were Christians. However, by the time they would get to the deepest parts of the battlefield, the dead would have been there for a long, long time, and rigor mortis would have set in. So the only way to cross their legs was to break them. And the Crusader has his broken legs like this inside. Now, unfortunately, once again, carbon dating has ruined our fun and proven that the Crusader lived about 100 years after the final Crusades took place. And the main reason that his legs are broken was probably just to get him into the box. But yes, that's St. Michael's. It's really, really cool. They used to be able to, beg pardon, apparently they have a screen up over the mummies now. They used to have them out on display, and people used to come and shake hands with the Crusader. It was considered to be very good luck to shake hands with the Crusader inside in St. Michael's, until one day a very, very, very unlucky man came by and broke one of the fingers off. So yeah, you can't touch him anymore, I'm afraid. But yes, we shall get up and carry on now to our next stop, just here around the corner. Okay, so welcome now to Hangmans Lane. Hangmans Lane is a very unusually named street in Dublin. Hammond, not a very Irish name. It is so named, in fact, because it's yet another phonetic corruption, much like Oxman's House. Hangmans Lane's name originates from its calling being named as Hangmans Lane. It was called Hangmans Lane because after the 1798 rebellion, when there was 1,200 United Irish troops locked up in the barracks here in Collins Barracks, they did not have gallows big enough to hang them all in a timely fashion. So while they were building newer, bigger gallows, an enterprising young British officer was walking down the street here and he saw these lovely street lamps. Now they weren't quite as high or as electric as they are today, but they were there back then. And he thought, yeah, I can hang some lads off these, you know. All along here, all along there, the people of Dublin would wake up every morning to a fresh set of hanged men, as proof that the British Army don't mess around. You know, so yes, we should carry on away from here, farther in to the north side of Dublin. Alright gang, welcome everybody to Smithfield Square. You smell that? The Guinness from across the river. You know, all the barley and everything gets mixed into it and it comes up into the atmosphere and gives that smell of, well, I've always compared it to, like, you know, warm Weetabix, when you get like the Weetabix warm milk, yeah? Excellent. Our American friends are like, what's a Weetabix? But yes, this is Smithfield Square. Now, Smithfield Square started off as a grazing area. Basically, the men and women who were over here in Ostman's Tune, they would need an area to basically graze their animals, and this was it. This was once a huge green expanse. And they would bring their animals down here to graze, because as I mentioned, the land here wasn't fantastic, so if there was somewhere good, they latched onto it. Very, very quickly, this square became a social centre. And obviously with social centres, very quickly there comes commerce, and once there was commerce, they decided to pave over the green area and set the place up as a marketplace. Of course, like I said, once commerce comes, so too does crime. and enter the character that I'm going to speak about today, a fellow by the name of Scald Brother. Now, Scald Brother was a thief that operated here in Smithfield Square. What he would do, he had a very particular modus operandi of going up behind somebody with a stick, cracking them in the back of the head, robbing whatever they had, and taking off running up to the top of Smithfield Square, which was previously, it was completely overgrown, complete wild bush, and disappearing. He was said to be faster than the lustiest man in all of Dublin. Apparently lusty used to mean fast, but I don't know. So what happened was the sheriff of Dublin and his men, they waited for Scald Brother up at the top of Smithfield Square. They were waiting for him to appear, basically, having committed all of his crimes. When he'd get to the brush, they'd attack him, set upon him and get him. What they weren't expecting was for Scald Brother to appear from a hole in the ground. It turns out that he had actually fashioned a network of tunnels beneath Dublin, and that was how he was coming in and out, and that was how he was disappearing so quickly, was he was just disappearing down into his tunnels. They waited there for him to come back after his day of thieving, where they promptly set upon him, kicked 7 shades out of him, and immediately hanged him there and then. That's what our idea of due process is, you know. But yes, he was hanged immediately. Now, the thing is, the entrance to Scald Brothers Caves fell in. As far as we know, the caves are still there, they're still around. So if anybody wants to go looking for any treasure, I'm officially supposed to tell you not to for insurance reasons, but if you do, just remember who gave you the tip off, yeah? Alright. No worries, gang, we're going to carry on now to the next portion of our stop just this way. Sorry, it's a short sit down this time. Hang on here. I'll stay out here on the road, so if I get hit by a car, it's grand. If you guys get hit by a car, it's big trouble, you know? But yes, welcome to Hendricks Street, everybody. If you look down there, you can see an old Georgian terraced house. That's one of the very few remaining in Dublin. At the time it was built, they would have built a whole row of them all along up here and around there. The Georgian terraced houses were built by the wealthy during one of the upticks in Dublin, in the North Side's popularity. They built these houses for themselves, and then after a couple of generations, when the North Side waned again, its fortunes waned, they promptly moved out back to the South Side and even farther down the country. So naturally enough, with these lovely big houses, well, big for the time, left fallow, poor people promptly moved in, and very, very quickly these houses became tenement slums. Very, very dangerous places to live, very, very rough. Entire families would rent out individual rooms, and there could be as many as 12 people per room. Tuberculosis was very, very common, as was issues from tainted, unclean water, and infant mortality was through the roof. Overall, they were very, very dangerous and bleak times to be alive here in Dublin, and in fact, they were actually in operation well into the 1960s as well. But of course, our stories concern not the economic hardships of the people living here, but the ghosts that made these parts their home. For example, here in number 7 and number 8 Hendricks Street. Now in number 7 Hendricks Street, in 1916, a family named Boylan moved in. Now this family named Boylan, they all moved into one room, and their father, Mr. Boylan, was warned when they moved in to be careful of the witch who lived directly above them. Mr. Boylan was a practical man, dismissed the notion of a witch and set about his life, until he went to sleep one night. He put his head down to sleep, and from upstairs directly above him he heard a shuffle, 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 and then a clang of a cast iron pot, and finally the chop of vegetables. Incredibly loud, ridiculously loud, especially super loud for 3 o'clock in the morning. So this promptly kept Mr. Boylan up all night, and again the next night and the next night. So it had been 3 or 4 days without sleep. Mr. Boylan called in sick from work, and he stayed at home trying to get some sleep. He looked out the back window and he saw into the back garden of the tenement house. Now this was something that they used to do. They used to grow vegetables in the back because otherwise they'd starve. And this woman was gathering vegetables into a cast iron pot. This old woman, Mr. Boylan, putting 2 and 2 together, figured that must be the one. This must be my tormentor. And he opened the window. Now, I'm sure those of you who've been here in Dublin long enough know that the people of Dublin are not shy about roaring at each other for seemingly nothing. So he opened the window and he roared down at the old woman, "You, stay there!" He needed to talk to her. So he turned around, ran inside, went down the stairs to the back door, and it's worth pointing out at this time that there was only one way in and one way out of that back garden, and that was the way that Mr. Boylan came. But when he got to the back door and he burst it open and looked into the garden, she was gone. There's no sign of her at all, no sign of the pot, no sign of the vegetables being missing, no sign of this woman whatsoever. Mr. Boylan was very upset, very freaked out. He did what any good Irishman in that situation would do, and he went out and he got langers drunk. So, coming home with his skin full of Dutch courage, he went up to the old lady's room and he started banging on the door and roaring into her that he only wanted to talk and he needed to figure this out. Why are you making stew at 3 o'clock in the morning? Of course, the noise that Mr. Boylan was making in his drunken state, it awoke the other neighbours and they were very upset with him, so he turned away, his tail between his legs, admitting defeat, hoping that he'd sleep that night, when inside he heard a shuffle, shuffle, shuffle. And Mr. Boylan flew into a rage as he noticed that this woman was just ignoring him. And he turned round and with the drunken might of 10 men proceeded to kick the door down with one mighty blow. Of course, the door was actually a little bit rotted. The wood was a little bit rotted. Don't really know. Mr. Boylan couldn't really figure that one out until he kind of looked inside. Now imagine the smell probably hit him first. The smell of, well, death, you know, of a fetid, rotting, bloated corpse in front of him lying on the bed. This was the old woman that had caused him so much torment. This was the old woman he'd seen out the window, lying before him dead at least 6 months. Flies, maggots, the whole shebang everywhere. I don't think Mr. Boylan kept his pints down at this point, as he noticed beside her was a cast iron pot full of stew, vegetable stew that had been sitting there for just as long as she was, thick, congealed, rotten, vile, and Mr. Boylan promptly turned around and fled, and he moved his entire family out the next day and they were never seen or heard from again. Next up we have number 8 Hendricks Street. In number 8 Hendricks Street there was an old married couple. They'd been married together a long time, long enough to hate each other, you know. There's a knowing look. But they'd been married long enough to hate each other, and all they did was argue, morning, noon and night. They argued, they screamed, they roared, they had all sorts of abuse thrown at each other. It was a terrible, terrible time to be their neighbours. Until finally he died. And she was very, very happy. I imagine it was the best day of her life. As she sat down in front of the fire, finally free of him, to warm her bones and have a bit of peace and quiet, she heard in her left ear a harsh, guttural whisper, almost indistinguishable from what it might have been, just whisper, whisper, whisper. And she looked and turned and there was nothing there. And in her right ear she heard the same whisper, whisper, whisper. And she looked and there was nothing there. And in her left ear the whisper got louder, still indistinguishable, no idea what was being said to her. But it got louder and louder in both ears until it was basically a full-blown shout in either ear, deafening her completely. She stood up, running out of her room, completely in tears, completely distraught. She got to the bathroom, which was just inside the house at the time. Now, this was in the 1960s. Like I said, the tenement slums have been in operation way into the 60s, and electricity had actually reached them by this point, so she was able to pull on the switch, turn on the light inside in the bathroom. She looked in the mirror, and there was a face looking back at her that was not her own. It was a familiar face, not quite the same, twisted slightly, with a sick, malicious grin spread across it. And this happened to her every single night, again and again and again, for weeks on end. She complained to her neighbours. They did not hear any whispering, any shouting, any roaring from the room. They're like, no, it's been very, very quiet in your place, thank you. But of course, finally, after a couple of weeks of this, she died. She passed away herself. And they promptly rented their room out again to a new family, who complained non-stop to the neighbours about screaming matches happening inside their apartment morning, noon and night. No idea where they were coming from, but of course we know that sometimes death doesn't always do you part, you know? Anyways, we're going to carry on to our next stop. We've got 2 ways to go, the normal way or the spooky way. Which one do you want?
Spooky.
Nobody ever says normal. Why do we even offer this? So, who's ready to dig their own grave? is how it usually ends on this tour. No, okay. Come on around, won't bite. I'm going to direct all your attention though to the building over here. This is the Irish Museum of Decorative Arts and History, but prior to that it was Collins Barracks, home of the Irish Army for the majority of the 20th century. Prior to that it was just the Dublin Barracks, home to the British Army here in Ireland. What I'd like to point your attention to at the moment is the lookout tower, just there. A good look at that, can you see? Now from that lookout tower, even back in the olden days, you could get a very good view of everything that was around here, because it's actually quite well lit. Right here, in the spot where you're standing, my friend from California, there stood a British soldier at one time. There's two soldiers up there, both British, of course. One of them was Irish, the other was English. And the English soldier looked down here and saw the guy in the full red uniform, which was the style at the time. And they called out to the soldier that was down here, and he turned around and looked back and smiled and he waved back. And they were quite shocked, especially the English soldier, when he realised that the man waving back at him was his brother. His brother had actually died years previous fighting the Zulu. So he completely flipped out, ran down the stairs trying to catch up to him. The Irish soldier was a few feet behind him all the way down. They got down here, and where you are standing now, of course, there was nobody. Nobody standing there anymore. The English soldier, he looked around all over, completely distraught, terrified. He turned around to the Irish soldier, handed him his gun, handed him his coat, and said, "I'm off to find my brother, have a good time." And off he set into the night, never to be seen or heard from again. Now, as I said in that story, there was an Irish soldier in there. I'm sure it probably seems quite peculiar, maybe for some of you to think that there was Irish men in the British Army, but of course it wasn't that odd, because it was there was very few places in Ireland at the time where you could get 3 square meals a day, a decent wage, and of course a nice red uniform to impress all the ladies. One such young man from Ireland joined up so he could get that uniform to impress the ladies. And on his day when he was getting it, he got a second or a third hand uniform, maybe even fourth or fifth. It was destroyed, it was in tatters down at the bottom. It was all burn marks and stab wounds in it. It was probably covered in blood, although he couldn't tell because it was already red. And of course he turned to the quartermaster and he said to him, like again, this kid was 16 years old. And he said to him, "This is in bits, could I get a new one, please?" Quartermaster took that to be insubordination. And as I said earlier on, the British Army don't mess around. And he promptly sentenced that young man to 500 lashes. Now this guy, like I said, 16 years old, small whippet of a lad, smaller than you, I'd say. You know, he knew he wouldn't be able to survive being tied to a post and whipped 500 times. He knew he wouldn't be able to live through it, so he decided to top himself. He got up on the roof before his whipping, and he jumped off. Unfortunately, is anybody here who's tried to kill themselves? I'll tell you. You don't jump off feet first. Unfortunately he did, and managed to nearly break both his legs. Now they found him in agonizing pain, and the medical corps that was here brought him to the infirmary. They gave him the best of care, that reset his bones, put him in casts, gave him the absolute best of care, bleeding edge care for the time. And after about 6 months of this wonderful care, being kept in a lovely bed, being given the nicest food they had, being just generally taken absolute 5 stars. You know, it was the kind of care that they took care of this guy. Once he was able to get back on his feet again, move around, they tied him to a post and whipped him to death. As I said, the British Army don't mess around. You know? So we're going to carry on across the way over here. Now, everyone be careful going over here. This particular part of the tour can be a bit hit and miss, but you're big, you should be able to take care of us, right? And yes, you guys too. You're English, you're definitely going to be good at it. So let's go. Anyways, folks, welcome over here to Troves Acre. Troves Acre is so named because of the 1798 rebellion. Wolf-toned soldiers, they had this great idea that in order to show how different they were to the rest of the aristocracy of Europe, because at the time it was not uncommon for men to have their hair quite long, longer than mine, especially amongst the aristocrats of mainland Europe. So in order to show how different they were and to maybe strike a bit of fear into the British armies that they'd be going up against, the foppish Brits as they called them, they decided to shave their heads, to crop them nice and tight and almost to the bone, so that they could show just how terrifying they were. Of course, this promptly backfired when the rebellion failed, and of course after they all fled they were very easy to pick out of a crowd because they were the only ones with the shaved heads. And they were brought back here. Now you remember I said to you that 1,200 United Irishmen were hanged. Where do you think they got buried? Right over here. And they weren't spaced out, they weren't given their own little plots, no. One big hole, all of the corpses thrown in. It's a mass grave. Now, you may be curious as to why they treated this mass grave with much more respect than they treated the graveyard we were in earlier on. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. One in particular, in 1997, Collins Barracks was decommissioned and was going to be redesigned into a museum. This area here was going to be turned into a car park for the museum. The local people here got very, very upset. They didn't care about the Protestant graveyard getting filled in, but they did care about the site of the United Irishmen, Catholics and Protestants, who were laid to rest here. Not even laid to rest, just dumped in a hole, dumped in a pit. And they complained and kicked up a fuss, and they happened to be very, very lucky, because the Dublin City Council in general, they don't really care what the people think. But this one time they did, because this one time it happened to be 1997, and the following year was the bicentenary of the 1798 rebellion. So this area here, rather than being turned into a car park, was kept as Troves Acre, where the Irish soldiers, when they were stationed here, would play football just over there, regardless of who was buried beneath them. Soldiers, they have to be a little bit callous, I suppose. And then finally, this is now a monument to Irish soldiers that had fought and died throughout the 20th century and the 19th century in foreign wars, in places like Crimea, World War I at the Somme, in places like World War II, and of course even in Vietnam and during UN peacekeeping missions throughout the 20th century. This is our tribute to them. Now, we're going to carry on to our next stop. It's our final stop. Good news is, it's a pub. Hey, bad news is, it's the longest walk. So let's all get ready, and of course we're going to be stopping at the traffic lights this time because it is a main road and I don't want any of you to die. You know?
But then we could be part of the tour.
No. American ghosts are very bad for the tour because American ghosts know how to comment on Yelp. British ghosts not so much. We'll be okay. Let's carry on. Hello, one last time everybody, and welcome to our final spot on the tour, the Brazen Head Pub. Allegedly the oldest pub in Ireland, but definitely the oldest pub in Dublin. Founded in 1198. If I'm asking you guys if I had a shot of whiskey for every time I was in the oldest pub in Ireland, I'd be dead from liver failure. You know? But this one might just be it. Now, a few people who have spent time in the Brazen Head over the years, one of whom is a fellow by the name of John Little. John Little was an Englishman. He came over here in the mid to late 1600s, and he was drinking in this pub, and he bet all the patrons in there that he could stand in the middle of that bridge there and shoot an arrow from the middle of the bridge right into the steeple of St. Michan's Church. This fellow's name, this Englishman's name, like I said, I believe is John Little. I said that already. My memory's not what it used to be. I'm old, you know. But yes, and he stood in the middle of the bridge and shot the arrow, bam, right into the middle of the steeple. People came from as far afield as Sligo to try and knock it loose, and of course they could not, until finally after about 3 weeks the wind knocked it out. Now, John Little is actually a bit of a famous character. He was Robin Hood's buddy, Little John. Clues in the name, John Little. But yes, Little John. He was pardoned by King Richard the Lionheart, and he came over here to Ireland, where he continued robbing from the rich, but he stopped giving to the poor. And eventually they caught him, and anybody want to guess what happened to him? Hanged. Meat is hung, sir. Men are hanged. You know, but yes, he was hanged. Unfortunate for him, I suppose. Now, the final story that I'd like to tell you guys again involves the Brazen Head Pub and somebody who actually had lodgings here. A man by the name of Robert Emmet. Now, Emmet was a soldier of Wolfe Tone's in the 1798 rebellion. He managed to escape capture somehow, probably by keeping his hair long. And he came here over the years, and he had lodgings here, and he planned a new rebellion. Now, he learned from the mistakes of Wolfe Tone. Now, Tone's big mistake was being so open with it, and he being infiltrated almost immediately by spies. Emmett kept everything secret. He kept everything compartmentalized. Nobody knew the full story. He kept everybody in the dark except himself and one or two others. Emmett was actually brought low by a completely different issue, just general traditional bad luck. When the warehouse that he was storing all of the munitions caught on fire. And of course it was full of gunpowder, it was full of shot, it was full of guns, it was full of cannon, it was full of explosives of all descriptions. So naturally enough it went up like the 4th of July. And of course the British forces up in Dublin Castle thought to themselves, wow, didn't that one warehouse explode rather spectacularly? Let's look into that, you know? So they did. They found out Emmett's name was on the lease. They found out Emmett had lodgings here in the Brazen Head, and they promptly found out all of his plans by coming down here, listening, infiltrating, lying, and the whole shebang. And on the day of the rebellion in 1803, when 2,000 fighting Irishmen were spreading in from all over the country, they infiltrated them all with spies. And these spies spread disinformation. They told him that Emmett had died. They told him the rebellion had been cancelled. They told him to go home. The whole thing was off. So rather than 2,000 fighting Irishmen showing up here ready for rebellion, 83 showed up looking for a scrap, and they promptly proceeded to get rat-arse drunk in here, and then what was supposed to be a fiery, beautiful rebellion of 1803 turned into a drunken riot. On a night not unlike this, lashing rain, just people coming out, kicking the heads into cops, getting the heads kicked back into them, and of course the rebellion failed almost immediately. Emmett managed to escape capture once again. He got back here, taking all of his effects, and instead of leaving the country, which was his plan immediately, he went to spend one last evening with his girlfriend, whom he loved dearly, and that was where they caught him. They caught Emmett and they brought him before our old pal Lord Norbury. We all remember Lord Norbury?
Yeah.
Yes? Who was he? Come on, say it. Come on, audience interaction, guys. The hanging judge. Good on you, Jared. You're my favourite, Jared. Sorry, girl from Sydney. You're my favourite now. But yes, that is who he was, the hanging judge. Now, as I said to you before, what usually happened before the hanging judge was people would protest their innocence. They would beg for their lives. They would plead and cry and scream and stamp their feet and beg for mercy. Mercy which Norbury never showed anyone. Emmett, on the other hand, he knew what was coming. He knew he was going to the gallows no matter what happened. So rather than beg for his life, he gave a fiery and impassioned speech about the nature of freedom and what should happen, how people should be treated. And I'm not going to quote it all back to you because we'd be here all night, but I will give you the final words, the closing part of the speech, which was, "Let my epitaph not be written until my country is free once again." Powerful stuff. He then went to the gallows, was hanged and buried in an unmarked grave. We don't know where he is. He could be in the pit in Troves Acre for all we know. He could be in St. Mickens. He could be in St. Audens. He could be anywhere. We don't know. And that is why we haven't written his epitaph. So guys, thank you very much for braving the weather with me tonight. You've been an absolute treat. I hope you've enjoyed yourselves. If you guys have any questions, I'll be here for a few more minutes. Thank you guys very, very much. You can clap now. Thanks to you, gang. Now, the Brazen Head's a lovely pub. If you feel like a lovely pint of Guinness or